Very much, and it's lovely to be here. Thank you to the hosts. I know sometimes these things take a lot of energy to arrange, and it's just great we got all these people to show up. Now, my name is John Thorlin. I'm running for Republican nomination, 18th Essex District. One thing I will say that I never really liked about campaigning is slogans. I always like to think what we really need to talk about are the fundamental ideas, the fundamental principles that are going to differentiate us from the Democrats in the state, and they're going to take us back into power. So what I want to tell you about, first of all, is the principle that I go by when I consider my vision of government, and then I want to talk a little bit about the vision of government I think is ruining the country and the state right now. My vision of government was outlined by a young red-headed man over 200 years ago, and the thing he said was, the sole purpose of government is to secure for its citizens the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Now, he also said, this young man, Thomas Jefferson, also said, and I love this quote, "I predict future happiness for the American people so long as they can prevent the government from wasting the labors of the people under the pretense of taking care of them." Notice that the founders said that we have the right to pursue happiness. They never said that the government, that people have the right to demand that the government provide them with happiness. I think what's really destroying the country right now and destroying our state is that people are moving away from Jefferson's vision of government and towards the competing vision of government, which is the entitlement mentality. The entitlement mentality arises whenever people demand that their government provide them with material wealth. And we all know, we've seen government. Government doesn't produce wealth. People produce wealth. So when people say that they want the government to provide them with something, what they're really saying is that they think they have the right to demand it from their neighbors. The entitlement mentality has had a lot of manifestations over the years. Hundreds of years ago, it was kings and hereditary aristocrats who thought that they had the right to use the government to steal money from the hardworking citizens who actually earned it. Nowadays, we can see bankers who demand bailouts and bonuses regardless of whether anyone wants their products. We can see the GM CEO and Chrysler CEOs running off to Washington every time they think they made a bad business decision. Unfortunately, that's here in Massachusetts too. And we all know that, right? We spend more on socialized health care every year than on education, infrastructure, and public safety combined. So when you think about what you think the fundamental purpose of government is, if your first answer is health care, Massachusetts right here is the place for you now. But if you think it should be about protecting the citizenry, ensuring the rights of the people, and even if you think it's about things like infrastructure and education, those things are a distant second to the idea that the government should be providing health care to each and every one of us. But no matter how depressed I get about the state of the state or the state of the country, I always know that there's still hope. And in that vein, I want to talk to you about the most inspirational person I've ever met. Her name is Mary. She works at a grocery store in Andover, and she works the register. She enjoys coming to work. She comes to work with a smile every day. She enjoys talking to the customers. And there's nothing more that she loves in the world than spending her paycheck on the things that matter to her. Foremost among them, going to the movies. Now, she happens to be mentally handicapped. And some people would say that for that reason she deserves our pity. But she's never asked for our pity, because that's not what she wants and it's not what she needs. What she wants and needs is nothing more than the right to pursue her own happiness without the government constantly biting away at her income and trying to fund an entitlement mentality state with her money. And when I was working 3 jobs to put my way through Harvard, I never thought I was entitled to demand money from the students who didn't have to work to pay their way through. Because I knew I was working hard to pursue my own happiness, just like Mary at the grocery store. And whenever I see Mary, I know that there's no need for America or Massachusetts to walk down the road to fiscal obscurity, and that the idea that drove the founders to create America is never really going to die. Now, once we embrace the idea that we need to get away from the entitlement mentality, I think that's the important first step. I think once we all agree on that, then we got to start talking about how we're going to do it. And I think one of the most important ways to signal it is cutting taxes. I support the idea of lowering the state sales tax to 3%, and I'll tell you why. Thank you very much. People talk about fiscal balance, and they talk about government waste a lot, and they say, well, we can only really afford to cut it to 5% because maybe we can cut some salaries here and there, but we're never going to be able to cut enough so that we can live with a 3% state sales tax. But I mean, it really is about your fundamental vision of government. Healthcare is, we're spending way more money than on anything else. If you take on healthcare as an entitlement, you can totally revamp this state. You give money back to hardworking families who actually generated it in the first place. You give it back to retirees who worked hard all their lives to have the money that they're spending now. You give it back to students who are diligent and are trying to work their way through school. And most importantly, you give it back to people like Mary. People who want nothing more than the government off their back and the right to pursue what makes them happy. I think that's really what America is all about. And that's the vision that's always inspired me. Thinking about people like Mary. People who just want to live happily and to pursue their own happiness. Now, there are a lot of other ways that we can talk about cutting spending, and I totally embrace it. You know how, anyone know how much a state representative makes, by the way? And oh yeah, they jacked it up a little bit. It's even more than that now. Last time it was
4,000.
Yeah, and that is insane. I can't stress enough how crazy it is to say that you have a citizen legislature and then turn around and pay them $74,000 a year. I mean, I have worked a lot of kind of minimum wage jobs in my life. I was a projectionist for a while. I was a guard at dormitories to help pay my way through. And it's insane to think that I'm going to get paid $74,000 to be a state rep. And so one of the first things I'm doing when I get in there is saying, no. You know, if people want to vote and say, no, I think the work I'm doing is really worth way more than anything people are doing in the private sector, way more than the average for the private sector, I want that on record. And I want that record to be online, which is another thing that the Democrats in charge are never going to accept. Because that's a key part of how Democrats operate. They love to think they know better than the people, and regardless of whether the people know about it, they just think, well, as long as we toss them another entitlement, they'll sit down and shut up. And honestly, I think if I had to say the one important difference between Republicans and Democrats on a more operating level, it's that Republicans think all of us can make decisions for ourselves. Democrats think they know better. And until we totally reject that idea, it's just going to be more of the same. So if you want to cut off one-party rule and move away from the entitlement mentality state, I'm asking you to vote for me. I can't promise I can win all these battles alone, but I'm going to fight it, and that's the important part. Once we stop fighting little battles, we'll have skirmishes all the time over little things, but once we win the ideas battle, and that's absolutely what we can win. I've spent my entire life winning the ideas battles. I mean, I grew up in Andover, I went to Harvard undergrad, now I'm at Harvard Law, and I can tell you I've had some arguments with liberals in my time. Elena Kagan, I was arguing with her before it was fashionable. You have no idea. And it's just, once you start calling them out on their basic ideas, that's when you start winning these battles. They don't have logic on their side. They really don't. They have emotion. They try to say, well, wait a minute. If you don't favor welfare for the poor, you're obviously just heartless. No, not at all. What we need to do is fight that idea. Compassion isn't about having the government pay for things. Because remember, government doesn't produce wealth. They're just taking it from us. And you know, I'll tell you another story in another vein about personal freedom that I think is potentially one of the more dynamic areas for the future. Anyone support charter schools in this room? Anyone know about charter schools? I will tell you, I used to teach 7th and 8th graders from Lawrence. And you know, we all know Lawrence public school system. You know, to say it's bad is to say that the Patriots were okay back in the early part of this decade. But I would teach these kids math and English, and they would. And I'll tell you another thing. I love history. It's kind of my side interest. Once you start telling these kids stories that aren't in their curriculum, you know, when they have their World War II kind of segment, they talk about gays in the military, and they talk about the role Native Americans played, but they don't talk about Iwo Jima, they don't talk about anything else. But history is nothing more than interesting stories. There are a couple of kids in Lawrence now who are huge supporters of Israel because I told them the story of the Yom Kippur War. People really do respond if you make things interesting for them, and they're never going to get that through a standardized curriculum. So that's another aspect that I think is important for the future. And really, that is the fundamental purpose of my candidacy and the fundamental principle that's going to guide me throughout my entire tenure as state representative if you elect me. I'm going to make people free, and I'm going to restrict government. And I see the countdown is about to get me, so thank you very much.